Thank you so much, Debbie, for that wonderful talk. We will now open our discussion with the audience. So please put your questions in the Q&A. We don't have any yet.
We don't have any yet. Here we go. So we have a question from Bruce Lewenstein, who says, thank you for a fascinating and stimulating talk. Each of your 5 major examples is known for the richness of their thought. Did any of them engage themselves in serious interaction beyond intellectual elites, the activities that today we would call public engagement? Did they give public lectures, and if so, were they traditional disseminations of knowledge, or did they participate in debate, especially with social groups beyond their own? So he says after I typed this, you gave the example of Neurath, so.
Okay, great. That's a wonderful question. How I wish that we had transcripts of the adult education courses that Zilzel and Neurath taught in Vienna in the 20s. We don't. Whether or not they engaged in debate with non-experts is such a great question. I can only imagine that they did, based on their publications, based on the tools that they were trying to give the public, precisely in order to provide what Fleck considered the necessary friction, right, to the course of science. In the case of Schrödinger, I think we see that his engagement with the public, mostly in writing, he published numerous popular articles in the 20s and 30s and beyond, literally did react back on the way he practiced science. I think that is the only way we can explain his insistence on the wave formulation of quantum mechanics, that it corresponded better to common sense than Heisenberg's matrix mechanics.
Okay, any other questions from the audience on Debbie's talk?
Yes, we have a question from Katie Stouffer, I believe. Following on Bruce's question, is there any evidence in their publications that they gave credit for ideas that they might have generated through debate?
So I'm assuming that the question is, did they ever credit a non-expert with contributing to their own scientific ideas? There too, we have a really wonderful question. I'm trying to think of where we might see this. Where would you find such an attribution? Probably not in print is the historian's problem. What we have mostly are publications that, if they have footnotes, would be citing scholarly pieces. So that, I think, is a question for research. We would need to dig into personal papers and archives and minutes of meetings such as they exist to see whether in less formal circumstances they were crediting others. It's a really great question, one that the history of science has been struggling with ever since the notion of the invisible technician was first formulated by Simon Schaffer and Steve Chapin, pointing out how scientists were very crafty in choosing whether or not to mention that there were people helping them conduct their experiments, right? Only when something went wrong would you see that kind of attribution. And more recently, a lot of historians of science have been focusing on the work of what are called go-betweens or knowledge brokers, who remain invisible in scientific publications, but with proper archival work, we can retrace the contributions to scientific knowledge of these non-experts, many of whom were locals in colonial spaces, indigenous peoples. And so that's very important work. And I think the question you're posing would be research along those lines.
We have another question from Lillian Fisher, who asks, do you see some of the same arguments in favor of public engagement put forward by scientists today, or do you feel like the narrative around public engagement has changed?
Well, I hope that is something that I will learn about from all the participants in this conference. I've been thinking about whether we might consider the March for Science as evidence of scientists perhaps adopting a similar ideology today, recognizing the role of the public in keeping their own activities on course. But I don't know enough about the movement to be a judge. I wondered too whether we might cite Shut Down STEM as an instance of scientists embracing humility and working for the democratization of knowledge. But again, it's not clear to me that may be overly optimistic on my part.
We have a question from Kian Min-Wu, and I hope I'm saying that right. Who says, thanks for the excellent talk. I wonder if the tension between democracy and science can be addressed in a separate manner. The examples from the 1920s do demonstrate that political democracy need to have no necessary connection to science or scientists. However, I suspect that those who say it is a democratic mean that scientific discussion itself is democratic, not politically, but in the sense that anyone can contribute and be included, can undermine those who are senior. Obviously, this is not always the case. There are dependencies and clickiness that we know of and deplore, but it seems to be a significantly different claim than the ones involved in Vienna in the 1920s.
Yes, okay, so I think this is an invitation to think about the ways in which the foundations laid by these thinkers in the 20s gave rise to inquiries into the sociology of science that have uncovered these kinds of inequalities and the power structure within the laboratory, within the field, right? So no, they weren't doing ethnographies of the lab back in the 20s, but I think there's inspiration, right? From people like Neurath, Fleck, directly to the kind of laboratory ethnographies and critiques of the hierarchies within science that have come out since the 70s. And certainly this is research that needs to go on, and it's research that we all as friendly critics of science need to make better known, and we really need to ask for reform.
The question is for the answer. And I have another question from Renee Wallace. It says, thank you for this historical perspective. I'm curious how well their perspectives were accepted and adopted by other scientists. And if they were, how long did that acceptance adoption shift to a more expert model?
Interesting. So let's think about this historically. An interesting kind of contingency is that what followed this effusion of ideas of public engagement was the Second World War, which was a moment that in many ways reinstilled strict hierarchy within the sciences and secrecy, utter insulation from the public. We think about the Manhattan Project, we think about the secrecy imposed on the scientists there, the military style hierarchy that they had to follow. We might say, no, scientists were not following these prescriptions at all. But we also might recognize that that was contingent based on the outbreak of war. I think, you know, what we see after the war with the Nuremberg trials and the beginnings of medical ethics, bioethics, can't be traced directly, certainly, to the inspiration provided by these thinkers in the 20s. But there, finally, I think in some ways we do start to see some kind of a response on the part of scientists to demands for accountability and for a more ethical practice.
Okay, and a question from Kevin Elliott. Fascinating talk. I wanted to invite you to elaborate on your comments right at the end about how there needed to be additional limits or guidance, such as ethics codes, because democratic engagement with science wouldn't guarantee that scientists didn't engage in problematic activities like the Tuskegee study. I imagine that many people might worry that public movements could cause problems in science as well as having good effects. Would you like to say more about how to navigate these potential problems, i.e. bringing in broad public involvement while maintaining science's integrity and ethical standards?
This is a great question. Again, I hope to learn from those in the policy world who might be taking part in this conference. But clearly, science needs to be regulated. And the erosion of the power of the EPA in recent years is testimony to how much we absolutely desperately need that regulation. What the relationship is between democratizing science and regulating it, I think is really tricky. I recommend a new book by Gil Eyal on the crisis of expertise that addresses this question exactly. And yeah, I mean, I am not equipped enough in my knowledge of the policy arena to give a better answer than Eyal.
Question from Maya Horst says, I'm sorry that I missed the first minutes of your talk, so maybe you said this, but I'm curious about whether scientists in the same fields, e.g. physics, have acknowledged these early thoughts of public engagement and its relationship to the development of science.
Yeah, so I think it would be very interesting to try to trace references to these early thinkers on public engagement in the period of the 60s and 70s, when, for a variety of contingent reasons, scientists do start to pay more attention to the need for a kind of legitimacy that can only come from engagement with the public, right? So, right, the 60s is a period when public representatives start to question where funding for science is going. They start to doubt the ideology that pure science inevitably produces useful spin-offs. And scientists are called to account. And this is when we see scientists like Alvin Weinberg theorizing the notion of trans science, a realm that lies between pure science and policy, where research is not going to be able to answer the questions that policymakers are asking, right? So trans science is the realm that we're living in when we discuss climate change and the pandemic, et cetera, today. I don't know of instances of these thinkers being referenced by Weinberg and his contemporaries in the 60s and 70s. But I would say that period in the 60s and 70s is also one where public-oriented scientists are coming together with historians of science, philosophers of science, sociologists of science, all of which are quite new disciplines still, and really thinking together about these questions. And those historians and philosophers are definitely citing some of the people that I spoke about today. I mean, that is when the Vienna Circle, as a phenomenon in the philosophy of science, comes back into kind of scholarly memory. So yeah, that's where I would look.
And it looks like we have one last question from Mahmoud Farouk, who says, in terms of ideological orientation among the scientists, was there more parity back then as opposed to now between liberal and conservative leanings? Only 6% of scientists today in the US self-identify as Republicans.
I'm so curious about the provenance of that statistic. It strikes me as unlikely that only 6% of American scientists identify as Republicans. So I guess I'm questioning the assumption that the sciences are predominantly progressive today. And so I'll maybe leave that out of my answer to the question. In terms of the makeup, the political makeup of scientific disciplines in the 20s, you see, as I tried to show, you see quite a gap between who was teaching at the universities and who was practicing science and writing about science outside of the university context. And actually, in Vienna, this goes back really to the early 20th century, that the successful candidates for university posts tended to be more conservative. They tended to conform to the Austrian states' ideologies of Catholicism and conservatism. Whereas new extra university institutions, privately funded laboratories, were providing resources for other scientists with other backgrounds and other beliefs, right, to actually conduct some really exciting research.
Okay, we have some discussion amongst the questioners about the statistic. And I will skip over into the next question from Burton Bargerstock, who says, very interesting talk, thank you. I'm wondering what role you think professionalization of science played in the context in which scientists you profile worked and promoted public engagement. I've been reading about the work of Enlightenment era people like Benjamin Franklin, who entered into scientific work and wrote about it without the kind of professional socialization that came later.
Great, yeah, so the professionalization of the sciences goes back to the 1830s. You could trace it back even earlier in Britain and Britain's empire. So, you know, the first people to be earning a living as scientists on state salaries, right? That's early 19th century. And the formation of professional societies with their own scholarly journals, right? That all happens in the course of the 19th century. So that by the 1920s, the sciences are indeed highly professionalized. But as you're pointing out, back in the 18th century, it was entirely different. Benjamin Franklin, you know, was he a professional scientist? You know, that's a meaningless question. He was, of course, you know, a man of all trades. And it was very easy, right, to contribute to the vanguard of science while being a statesman or a clergyman. You could be a school teacher. You didn't need to have a university post. So in some ways, the social landscape of the sciences was broader in the 18th century. On the other hand, of course, education was much narrower. Those who had the ability to learn to read and write were far fewer in number, and there were all kinds of other forms of exclusion based on race and religion. Your point about Franklin is well taken.
Okay. I have from Bruce Lewenstein, not a question, but a comment on response about the 1960s. Perhaps Weinberg didn't cite in the 1930s arguments, but I look at Barry, Commoner, and others like him, leaders of the more critical activist approach. And then question from Renee Wallace, who says, what's striking to me is that the scientists you profiled were concerned about making science accessible through common sense and common language based in daily type experience that all could relate to, understand, and use the scientific knowledge generated. That seemed to come from a place of common humanity between scientist and public. This is something worthy of pursuing today as a way to deepen engagement.
That's beautifully put. I second that wholeheartedly. And to Bruce, I would say I would love to have a conversation about the 60s and 70s with you at some point.
So I wanted to ask a question to you as a historian. One of the things that both your book that I was reading and your talk made clear is that in some ways we have to keep rediscovering the importance of the public in science. Like somehow it's forgotten and then rediscovered and forgotten, rediscovered. And I wonder, as a historian, do you get frustrated with that forgetting and the need to remember? And what does that say sort of about the way in which we construe ourselves as, scholars of these periods?
Oh, if historians got frustrated by the fact that so much of what gets announced as new ideas today, can be found, right, in our archives, then we wouldn't be historians, right? That's something that we're very used to. And I do think that science, in some ways, is cyclical. So this way in which the institutionalization of a more secretive and hierarchical science followed this democratization in the 1920s, and that in turn was succeeded by new demands for accountability and legitimacy. It's not a coincidence, right? You can see it as a kind of oscillation where scientists go through periods where their power is more in question and they reach out to the public, and then they manage to shore up their authority and they have less need for the public. So that's the way I would explain the forgetting, that it's very easy to forget in those periods when scientists feel assured of their authority, that anyone ever did theorize public engagement.
Yeah, I was wondering if you've seen any, okay, so this is again asking probably too much of you, but do you see progress or change in sort of the complexity or the depth or the modes of public engagement from, say, the 19th century into the first half of the 20th century? What sort of changed, or if anything, in the debates?
Oh, well, most importantly, the process of what we would call co-production of knowledge, of working across the boundary between experts and lay people to actually do research. There has been so much more close attention to the way that's conducted. And that goes back to the 70s. Chris Kelty has a wonderful new book called The Participant that gives us some of the history of thinking about what participation is and looks like and how it can be supported in that era, mostly of the 60s and 70s. So far more attention to process. And I think with that has been, in some cases, the emergence of really exciting and genuinely grassroots knowledge production. So I think about an initiative like Public Lab today, which is doing something that I think has never done before. Researching how ordinary people can research, right? That is a really exciting intellectual project.
That is fantastic. I'm glad to hear that we are making some progress. It's grateful. I want to thank again Debbie Coen for her wonderful keynote address. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you rejoin us at 11 o'clock, where we will have our first panel to discuss volunteer participation in science. So see you then. Thank you again to everyone.